Hello, and welcome to Confessions of a Successful Leader, hosted by me, Andrew Tallents, the self-coaching expert. In each episode of the show, we hear the insightful confessions of a successful leader who wants to inspire others to live their professional and personal dreams. I am always keen to hear your feedback, particularly in relation to the kinds of leaders you would like me to invite onto the show in future. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the rich insights from our special guest. Hello and welcome to another episode of Confessions of a Successful Leader, hosted by me, Andrew Tallents, the self-coaching expert. I'm delighted that Rich Goldfarb has joined me in the studio today. Rich, welcome.
Andrew, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's really good to see you on the show today. And all our audience will know out there that we always start by getting to know our guests. So just tell the audience a little bit about who you are and where your current focus is.
Sure. Well, I'm speaking with you now through beautiful Westchester, New York, in New York State, in the United States. I've had, I think, a lot of different lives when it comes to my background, and that includes the creative side, it includes heavily the business side, spans primarily the media business, of late some real estate, so quite varied.
Excellent. And tell us a bit about that creative side. I'm fascinated by that.
Well, like I said, many lives. One of those lives was music, which goes back to school, goes to junior high school here when I first started playing the trumpet and was in a number of bands, which then led to the revelation in my senior year of high school that I could sing, and we started doing some gigs for actual money, and ultimately led to me doing it full time with a band, and went on the road. I mean, any one of these spokes in my wheel could be an entire podcast, so I'll try to be careful about that. But that ultimately ended and led to me putting on a suit and going into the media business.
Super. And we'll come to that later on. I'm really interested in that sort of musical side of you as well. And not all of our guests open up to that side. So I'm really pleased that you've done that. And then if we look at today, your life today, what is it you do outside of your work interests that you do to recharge or to keep your breadth of interest alive? What is it you do outside of your professional interests?
Yeah, well, I'm probably still a little too mired in business stuff, which is perhaps one of the learnings that'll come out of this in time. But that said, I love nature. I like photography. I love music, obviously. I also have two large dogs, and they're a big part of our life. I have triplet boys. They're a big part of our life. So there are many things beyond business that take up my time, both happily and sometimes with stress.
Now, I'm sure the audience is wondering, who are more difficult to name, the boys or the dogs?
Well, so far until dementia hits, neither.
Excellent. I've got a dog as well. I love dogs and they do get us out into nature, don't they? Well, we'll come back to that later on. Let's go back to something you mentioned earlier about your childhood. We knew about your musical interests that started at school, but take us back before that. I guess we want to understand a little bit about what it was about your childhood that started to shape that early leadership style that emerged from you, about how you led your life. Just take us back to those days.
Yeah, very apt question. And I don't know if you're psychic or not, but I had a sort of a model childhood until I was 12. And since the title of the show is Confessions, I'm going to try and be as honest and transparent as I can. And I was kind of to that point, kind of quiet and studious and academic and an achiever. And my father unexpectedly passed away at that young age. And who's prepared for that, despite the fact that there were, loving people, including my mother, around me. And I had to have an older sister. But this goes back many, many decades ago, and the world was a little different. And the prevailing advice at the time, or a lot of discussion at the time, was, Rich, you're now the man of the family. And I think I took that a little too much to heart. And as a consequence, I never really appropriately grieved. I don't know that I have since, to be honest, but I developed, scar tissue and a certain stoicism. And what it seemed, and it had kind of a rocky 13th year in the world as a consequence. And it kind of opened things up a little bit. It made me more outgoing. It opened up the music stuff. And, once I got past that difficult it just made me, I think, a little more well rounded. But clearly, it had a lifelong impacts on everything.
Yeah, and I'm really interested, and I can relate to this because we had a discussion. I didn't have the loss of my father, but he was away an awful lot when I was 15 and affected, my life. So for you, and these are never good or bad things, but where was that voice coming from back then about the fact suddenly you're the man of the house? I'm really interested about where that came from.
Well, that voice, maybe part of it was indeed internal, but a lot of it was good intention from friends and relatives, the elders. And, maybe that was also a way, and I haven't thought about this till just this moment, them being able to deal with their grief. And maybe they thought they were doing the right thing, or maybe it helped them that, well, now there'll be continuity in this 13-year-old boy. My father had 5 brothers, unfortunately, none of whom are with us today, but they are in spirit. So most of it was external. And I felt like, well, I'm going to rise to the challenge.
Talk to us then. I'm really interested in this in terms of this happening to you, which is obviously devastating at that age. And then obviously you, like I did, have these emotions that we put somewhere as a stoicism that you were saying was coming out. How did that enable you to be successful in your early career as a leader?
I'm not sure I even can answer that intelligently, but I think one of the things it did was inject a certain degree of compartmentalization in my life. I think compartmentalization can be a very big positive, both for life and business. And I think you can also maybe wall off things too much. So there's a balance that I don't claim to have always found, but I think that's the goal.
And I guess the counter side to that, and this is what I've seen with a lot of leaders that come onto the show, we have some of these traits that come from those early experiences where we're driven, we basically get on with things, we're resilient, and yet sometimes the personal side of our nature, key relationships, well-being, sometimes maybe comes second. What was that like for you in terms of that kind of experience?
Yeah, well, you described it well. I did become driven. And part of that also was, prior to my father passing, we were definitely middle class. We didn't have lots of money, but we never felt like we needed anything. And a lot of that was because of fortunately, the love that my parents brought to the home, which as time went on, I learned was a rare thing, and not a common thing, which makes it a little more ironic that things happen the way they did, but I'm grateful that they did. And I've tried to approach things so that looking at how lucky I was that I had those 12 years as a foundation. Do you want to follow up? I don't know if
Yeah,
I fully
no, carry
answered you.
on. Please carry on. Yeah.
No, no, no. I don't know that I completely answered you.
Yeah, no, I was just, and that's a really good answer to the question I was looking for the answer. But it's also about this: how did you start to cope with that? Some people don't cope with it, or they don't even address it, or they don't ignore it in terms of this imbalance where the drive is actually overtaking everything they do.
Yeah, I think the drive did probably overtake a lot. Oh, I'm sorry. I started to say that, ultimately, with just my mother as the only breadwinner, it became evident that, hey, we may have felt, no need for money, but in the real world now in which we're living, money's kind of important. So that took on more importance to me. And that and just drive to succeed in whatever I was doing, combined to drive me forward. And of course, as it is with most people, it wasn't a straight line to success. And, there was some luck and serendipity and mentorship and all of that.
And can you remember, bearing in mind what happened to you when you were that age and you had this musical outlet for you as well in terms of how you described it? Can you remember what age, if ever, you actually had that first semblance of a dream about what you wanted your life to be like?
That's an excellent question. I think we all have a degree of fantasies in our head. And I don't know that that entirely ever goes away. Maybe it's pragmatic if it does. Maybe it's realistic if it does go away. I found these worlds that interested me, and it was so many things. Political science, music, business. I mean, it was so many different outlets, and I suppose in my mind. And I haven't, this dream hasn't totally died. And how it would be achieved other than through the lottery, I don't know. But how do you put it all together? So for a time, and I didn't take it seriously, I thought, "Well, I'm going to have to be some media mogul where I have the wherewithal to touch all of these things at once and go from a board meeting into a music studio and record, record something." So that's still a nice fantasy.
Yeah, absolutely. You obviously set out on that path when you were saying before that you obviously put the musical instruments down and then started to put a suit on that sense. So maybe talk to us about that transition. I'm sure the audience are interested in that, where you go from one life, which is very different, into, as you say, wearing the suit and becoming a
Yeah.
businessman.
Well, looking back, I'm glad that I went into music full time, and I was a singer, trumpet player. I was the leader of the group, and I was leading a pack of talented guys that didn't exactly have the same intellect and ambition and all of that. And I got to see the wonderful seamy side of music with managers and agents. And I was, as leader, responsible for those relationships, and I could wax eloquently about the road experiences and blah blah blah, and it's all kind of romantic looking back, but there was some crazy stuff back in those days. And after doing that for a relatively short amount of time, like about 2 years full time, I came to certain revelations that I was too dependent on others for my success in that business, that luck played too much of a role, and I needed to stop. So I did. And when I did, and by the way, everyone I think has many traumas through life. And this was about a time not too long after that I was in a really bad, I was very lucky, car accident, and totaled my car, a drunk driver. And in those days, drunk drivers got away almost scot-free. And this guy did. But anyway, that was sort of the culmination. It's time for a serious job of some sort of money-making proposition, which led me to not a fun existence in an electrical manufacturing company, working in an office in a warehouse in Long Island City, New York, across from Manhattan. Still living in Brooklyn in what's known as a two-fare zone, a bus and a subway to work. And that led me to, and here comes some aggressiveness and ambition, to connecting with a guy in New York in the media business, because one of my friends grew up and fell into the media business at this particular company. And we got to know each other on the phone, and we met once. And he said, "Call me every 2 weeks." And I said, "Are things going to change that quickly?" And he said, "You never know." And like clockwork, every Friday for 2 weeks, for 3 months, I called him. And the last chat was, "Rich, we're very close." And I said, "No, we're not." And he said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, we're more than close. Please listen to me carefully, because I'm serious about this. When I hang up the phone, I'm going to give notice, which gives you 2 weeks to go from close to closed. And I'm going to see you 2 weeks from Monday." And I hung up the phone, and I started 2 weeks later. Now that was, and all your viewers and listeners will be thrilled to know, that was for a job that paid $9,500 annually. So I think I could be impulsive under those circumstances. And that was the beginning of a many decades media career.
And just talking before we get into that, I'm really interested about it. But as you were making that call in terms of the ultimatum, what was going on for you? Was that coming from a place of extreme confidence that you knew this was going to happen? Or were you actually just really chancing your arm with this, not knowing what the hell the outcome was going to be?
This was, I think, a lovely combination of aggressiveness, ambition, frustration, desperation, and an acknowledgement that I don't care if I leave this job, I've had enough. It was all of that.
Yeah. And it worked.
It did.
That's interesting in terms of you going on that basis. So did you work directly for this individual at that point?
Indirectly, but
Okay.
he was the boss of the division I was in.
Okay, that's great. And then talk to us now again from a leadership perspective, because you're now in a media world, which obviously is very cutthroat at times back then as well. So just talk about that. So maybe the next decade and what your leadership journey was through that, what you were learning.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you asked that because I was in that initial company for a while, and it was a smaller company in the media business, which had a lot of positives. One of those positives is I got to sort of shape my career within that company the way I wanted to, and that takes a certain amount of initiative and what have you. So I started at this entry level position, and when I left, they used to make fun of me because I had two different business cards. I was VP of marketing and I was VP of an entertainment division that we formed. And I mention this because I had tremendous experience there, but I had never classically sold anything. And I bought things, I distributed programming, so it's kind of selling, but there wasn't direct dollars attached. And one of my great mentors who worked at the company Viacom, and he went on to conceive the very successful syndication of The Cosby Show, which is a whole other story. In any event, we became friends, and he called me one day and he said hi, and I said, Dennis, I know why you're calling. And he said, well, why? How do you know and why? I said, you want to go to lunch and you want to ask me to work with you. And he said, how in God's name do you know that? And I said, so let's have lunch. And that led to me getting a director of sales job at Viacom, having never sold anything directly. So leadership just, I don't know, I guess it was kind of innate, and it went from there into other things. I became involved with the cable network industry, working at a number of companies, working with two political polar opposites, Ted Turner and Rupert Murdoch. So it's been a colorful journey.
And let's talk about that transition, because I'm really loving what you're saying there about what's happened to you early in your life has meant then you become very resourceful, very driven, this is not about being selfish, but it's very self-focused. So it's very self-centered leadership in that sense. It's not the same as selfishness, because we're doing it for a reason in that sense. And then we have to start leading others, particularly in sales leadership around that. And sometimes there needs to be a change. Sometimes we can just be the way that we want. It depends on the culture. So what was it for you? What did you have to do differently to lead others effectively as well as yourself?
Yes, excellent question. Well, I think the first thing I would say is some of us fall in love with ourselves. And maybe, deep down, there's some other feelings involved. And a lot of confidence sometimes can be a masquerade for insecurity. But putting all that aside, do you have a psychology degree, by the way?
I wish I had.
Yeah, I don't think you need it. Putting all of that aside, part of my notion was, well, I'm pretty good at what I do, and I've been successful at what I do. Then I guess I should hire clones of myself. Here come the clones. And I can't tell you how long it took and when the epiphany took place, but I can tell you I realized what a huge mistake that is and how important it is to populate your team with actually very different people with complementary skills that can cover up for strengths and weaknesses of others, that can relate differently to constituents internally and externally. So that was an important lesson. Control, that's another important lesson. I kind of like to be controlling. And you can go back perhaps to some of the trauma in my life, and I only touched on a little, a little of it in this chat, that things come at you that you can't control. Could be in business, could be personal, could be both. And as a consequence of that, I think you find control as a concept very comforting. But of course, it can be misleading and it could be a mistake. And I talk about control in the form of delegation. So if you have staffing, if you have responsibilities that require, I'll use the word, a lot of bandwidth, then you're making a huge mistake unless you learn how to delegate and delegate effectively. So that's another learning ability to identify and nurture talent. And nurture is an important part of the equation because things, unless you're very lucky, just don't happen instantly or on its own. Another thing that I found is vitally important is clear messaging. And you may think you're being clear, and oftentimes you find that your staff says, no, I didn't know what you were talking about, or I don't know how to implement that, or please clarify. Um, and not always, because sometimes we do have to be like a military organization, I guess. And sometimes there's no time for questioning things too much. But what I also have found is at the right time and the right way with the right people that work for you, with you, explaining the why can be effective. But again, it needs to be done sparingly, not all.
No, I love that. And thank you for bringing up the trauma element again. There's a great book, I think it came out maybe 2 years ago now, by Gabor Mate called The Myth of Normal. And he's in his 80s now, Gabor, but very interesting author and thought leader in terms of trauma. And his premise is that actually, if we look back to our ancestors, whether it's our mothers and fathers or their parents, that there is already trauma built into our lives when we're born, even if we don't experience trauma in our childhoods. And if we have that view of life, which I agree with, it means, as you say, when you're leading other people, recognizing that it's normal for them to be experiencing some kind of trauma, even if nothing's happened to them. And that's how it manifests in the way they show up in the world is always a good approach to take. So I'm really pleased you've talked about that. And with that in mind, at this stage of your career that you're describing now, how were you making sure that you were managing your own well-being at this point?
Not extremely well, to be honest. And I haven't totally figured that out as we speak today. There's a lot of things I haven't totally figured out. I think if people are honest with themselves, there might be a lot of people that would raise their hand to that, if not raise a glass of champagne. So too much focus on business over the years, I have to say. And, some of that, I think if I strip things away, and this is a good conversation because I'm having some thoughts maybe I haven't had or haven't vocalized, is, some of it comes from fear of not having money, fear of not being successful. You had mentioned to me in a prior chat we had about the imposter theory. So, those things are there, they can creep in. However, the overarching thing is the typical, I want more, I want to succeed, you know, I have a healthy ego. Another thing I realized is while it's important for both internal and external purposes, create a brand, create your own brand. Along the way, don't forget that people that are with you want to create their own brands as well. So if you become the all or nothing, then they feel stifled.
Something's just come to me, Rich, which I want to ask you now. I don't know why it's come to me now, but I want to build on it. Bear in mind that you weren't creating space for your own well-being, and we've all done this in terms of focus on business and these spheres that come in. Bear in mind that early creativity that you obviously have within you still being manifest in terms of that musical career. How has that entered your life in the last 10 years? How have you managed to still have that creativity around you?
I'm not sure how much of the creativity I have left. What's interesting is, and I haven't really delved into this a lot, but think about, because I wrote songs as well. I did impressions as well. Did some commercial voiceovers, but
Yeah.
I'll spare you now. Uh, but when it comes to songwriting, think about it. There is a stage in life, age-wise, when you're very prolific with writing music, and then it kind of goes away. So if you think about individuals in the music business, bands in the music business, how much new material have they created later in their life? And in many cases, the answer is none. So, and I think that if I can guess at explaining that, when you're younger, you're going through some more evolutionary things. And one of those things that I think drives a lot of music, it did for me, was relationships with women, with girls, with dating, with breakups, with all of that stuff, which creates a certain creative juice that doesn't continue forever. So, so for me, I guess it's more appreciating music than actually the making of it, unfortunately, at this stage. And my musical horizons have expanded somewhat through my children. Growing up with them and the new forms of music, and growing up now with them. They're 23, so they're still in the center of music listening. So that's interesting. It's fun.
Yeah. And again, this is another great book I read a couple of years ago. I think I've got to get the author right, but it's The Path of Least Resistance. I think it's by Robert Fritz. Is it Robert Fritz? It may be Robert
I
Fritz.
think so.
Yeah.
I know the book. Yeah.
Yeah. And what I love about that book, about what you're talking about there, it links to this thing about when we're successful and driven and have control. And yet, obviously, what he talks about is letting go of all of that. It's basically the planting the idea, what I want to do, and then leaving it, and then it nurtures. So I'm really glad that you raised that. Other people can go away and look at that, how they feel about it too. So we're coming towards the end of our time, Rich, but I've got a couple more questions for you. And I've loved this journey so far. It's gone in so many different directions. How would you describe your life right now in terms of, what you're doing and what it is that you gain from your life right now?
Yeah. Well, I'm still. I start with my three sons. They're a huge part, of the joy in life. It is a challenge. Two of them recently graduated college. One is graduating this May. The job market is very difficult for college grads right now, which a lot of people don't even realize. Maybe one of the worst markets that I've seen in my entire life. So there's that. And of course, that comes after spending the equivalent of many Ferraris on education. But that aside, you wanted to talk more about the joy side, I believe. So it's fun seeing them grow up, navigating all of this difficult territory. There's that word balance again. You try and guide them, but when you go beyond guiding, you get the opposite effect. So it's finding a way to be somewhat helpful, or you think you're being somewhat helpful. And it's then knowing when to back off. And, a lot of that is trial and error. I mean, if you think about life in general, there's a certain degree of experimentation. And that's how you learn or not.
Absolutely. And I'm just wondering now, if you had the ability to go back in time to your 12-year-old self, just after your father had passed, and you could describe to that 12-year-old there that you were the future vision of him, what kind of words would you say to him to give him some sense of what his life might become?
That is a very powerful question, and emotional. Clearly, and we touched on it, I would try to inject that you're 12 years old. You need to be 12 years old. Don't try to be 20 years old or 30 or 40 years old. You have to embrace your childhood such as it is, but there are things in there to appreciate. Mom, sister, whatever. You do not have the world on your shoulders. You are not the breadwinner. You are not the leader of this household. So that's part of it. The other part would be, and we started with this, is you are allowed to cry. You're allowed to feel what has happened to you. In fact, you have to let it out. And you were given the gift of your dad for 12 years. You were given the gift of your family. That foundation and what is within you will take you where you want to go.
Thank you for sharing that. And I do have one final question. I'm sorry about this, but it's about the future as well, Rich. So going to the past, if you were to look now for the next 5 or 10 years, you've obviously had so much experience, so many stories to tell, which we've only been able to touch on them today. What is left for you? What kind of legacy do you want to leave when you leave this mortal coil?
What I'd want to leave and what I do leave might be two different things. So I think what I might be leaving is 3 wonderful sons that are, I think, as objective as it can be, truly special, not without warts, just like me. And I think they will be contributors to people and business and life in their way. And I think that's the most important legacy. Another legacy, if I go back more to the past, I enjoyed, like I had said earlier, identifying talent and nurturing that talent. And something that has given me joy has watched some of the folks that were under my supervision in the media business achieve giant things. In some cases, far beyond my measure of success. Everything from assistants of mine. And one of the learnings, by the way, I'm sorry if I drift on a little too long. One of the learnings I didn't talk about was initially, I always felt like, particularly like my assistants or at the assistant level, don't aim too high because then they'll want to leave in 6 months. And I learned just the opposite. I learned go for the most talented people you can find. And either you're going to promote them within your division or within your Uber organization, or they're going to move on and you're going to do business with them at some point. In any event, don't stifle them. Don't aim low. So one of my legacies, I hope, is that in some way, be it small or more than small, I contributed to the careers of a lot of people.
Well, Rich, I think that's a great place to finish. I've loved the journey on the call today. Thank you for being so open, so vulnerable, obviously referencing the trauma which many of us feel, some of us can't feel, but all of us have within us at some point in our lives. So thanks again for being on the show today.
Andrew, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Confessions of a Successful Leader. You can access all previous episodes of the show at confessionsofaSuccessfulLeader.com. If you are interested in finding out more about conscious leadership and self-coaching, just type in Andrew Tallents into LinkedIn or your favorite browser, and you'll find my contact details and all the content that you need. Until next time, don't forget to stay present, curious, and above all, conscious.